Today, we're diving into the secret origins of the modern economy. And, well, we're actually starting with a scene that feels straight out of a Hollywood thriller. Just picture this. It's November 22nd, 1910. A private rail car is sitting at the Hoboken Terminal in New Jersey, and the blinds are drawn completely tight. Then, one by one, 6 of America's absolute most powerful men slip through the darkness, board the car, and just vanish into the night. And get this, they were only using their first names to hide their identities. Now, they weren't plotting a bank heist or anything like that. They were actually embarking on a highly covert mission to quietly rewrite the entire rulebook of American finance.
Now, you might be thinking I'm kind of exaggerating the whole cloak and dagger vibe of this trip, right? Well, Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of National City Bank, literally the most powerful bank in the country at the time, he later admitted that their journey was, in his own words, as furtive as any conspirator. I mean, wow. These financial titans were undertaking a completely secret expedition to design a financial system that would end up reshaping the United States and, honestly, the entire world for the next century. But it begs the question, why all the intense secrecy?
To figure that out, we really have to look at the historical context that forced them into the shadows in the first place. You see, America at this time was a massive economic powerhouse, for sure, but it suffered from this fatal recurring weakness. It had no central bank. And without a central bank, the economy just kept detonating. The financial panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 were absolutely devastating. We're talking businesses crumbling, banks shuttering their doors, people's entire life savings wiped out literally overnight. There was just zero safety valve to inject cash into the economy whenever credit completely froze up.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Panic of 1907. Let's step back into that terrifying autumn, which was basically the first worldwide financial crisis of the 20th century. So how did it happen? Well, a completely localized failure snowballed into a national catastrophe. Step 1, a speculator named F. Augustus Hines completely fails to corner the copper market, and the banks connected to him just start hemorrhaging deposits. Step 2, the panic spreads to trust companies, which were basically the unregulated shadow banks of that era. The massive Knickerbocker Trust falls, and depositors utterly panic. They're lining up around the block, just desperately trying to pull out their savings. And finally, step 3 is total contagion. Global credit completely evaporates. Businesses can't get loans, workers are laid off en masse, and the stock exchange nearly grinds to a dead halt. The entire financial system was teetering on the edge of implosion.
Because there was no government lender of last resort, the fate of the entire American economy fell squarely into the hands of one guy, a 70-year-old titan named J.P. Morgan. During the absolute climax of the panic, Morgan literally summoned New York's top bankers to his private library, locked the massive doors, and flat out refused to let anyone leave until they pledged millions of dollars of their own money to stop the bleeding. And through sheer force of his own personal wealth and some iron-fisted negotiating, Morgan and a handful of others barely managed to contain the crisis.
But here's the thing. While the panic was contained, it left the entire nation with this absolutely terrifying realization. What happens next time? What happens to the financial security of 90 million Americans when a crisis is just too big for Morgan to handle? Or, quite frankly, what happens when he's gone? Relying on the mood and the bank accounts of a few ultra-rich guys was definitely no longer a viable strategy for a massive industrial superpower.
The public was totally outraged by all this, which leads us directly into Section 2, the First Name Club. Congress scrambles and passes the Aldrich-Freeland Act, which officially tasks Senator Nelson Aldrich with finding a permanent solution. But Aldrich, he knew he couldn't do it alone. So, he recruits Wall Street's finest in absolute secrecy.
The crucial thing to understand here is just how insanely interconnected and powerful this crew really was. First, you have Senator Nelson Aldrich himself. His daughter was actually married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., so you've got massive political power instantly merging with the Rockefeller fortune. Then you have Paul Warburg, representing the Kuhn, Loeb & Co. International Banking Dynasty. You've got Henry Davison, a senior partner over at J.P. Morgan, and Frank Vanderlip from National City Bank. Aldrich picked these specific men with surgical precision because they represented the 3 most dominant financial power centers in the Western world. But because of that exact fact, they absolutely could not be seen together in public.
The paranoia was almost comical, to be honest. They adopted this tongue-in-cheek moniker, the First Name Club. And to sell their cover story that they were just, heading south for a casual hunting trip, Paul Warburg, who was a brilliantly technical German-born banker who had never fired a gun in his entire life, actually carried around a borrowed shotgun. He even joked later on that if any reporter had seen him trying to awkwardly handle that weapon, they would have instantly known the whole thing was a total sham.
So they finally arrive at the ultra-exclusive Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia, and the sheer gravity of this meeting is just mind-boggling. To put this into perspective, this handful of men collectively represented roughly 25% of the entire world's wealth. Think about that for a second. 1/4 of all global wealth sitting in a single room, preparing to rewrite the rules for exactly how America's money would work.
Let's move on to the island itself for Section 3, Designing the Disguise. We're going to see how they constructed what some would eventually call a completely necessary reform and what others would call a deliberate cover-up.
So for 9 straight days, eating wild turkey and working deep into the night, they fiercely debated this new system. But the biggest fight? Actually, scratch that. It wasn't even about economics. It was entirely about politics. Aldrich really wanted a clean, efficient European-style single central bank. But Warburg strongly pushed back. He knew that the American public harbored this visceral, deep-seated distrust of centralized financial power. If they proposed a single central bank overtly controlled by Wall Street, it would be absolute political poison. So Warburg insisted on a decentralized disguise, a system of regional reserve banks that gave the outward appearance of democratic control, but functionally operated as one unified central bank.
These Trojan horse regional banks would serve one absolutely critical function, acting as a lender of last resort. Now, let's look at the economic science behind this method, because it all really comes down to one thing: liquidity. You see, in a fractional reserve banking system, banks don't just sit on a giant pile of your cash, they lend it out. So when a panic hits and everyone demands their money back at the exact same time, perfectly healthy banks can collapse simply because they lack immediate on-hand cash. By managing what's called an elastic currency, this central entity could digitally create and inject emergency cash into the system precisely when credit freezes. This mathematically halts the contagion in its tracks. So the financial engineering and the science behind it was totally sound, but the political wrapper they were putting it in, incredibly delicate.
And, well, despite all their intense secrecy and careful planning, the resulting Aldrich plan was a total political disaster. The second it was presented to the public, it just carried the toxic scent of Wall Street. A massive progressive backlash erupted. A congressional investigation, known as the Peugeot Committee, began aggressively exposing this overlapping web of power they called the money trust. And then Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats completely swept the 1912 elections, and they had explicitly opposed the plan. So the Aldrich plan was brutally defeated, dead on arrival.
But hey, this explainer has a pretty massive twist. Welcome to Section 4. The Federal Reserve is born. We are now moving from the ashes of the failed Aldrich plan right into the dawn of a whole new era. The sheer irony of what happens next is just stunning. The victorious Democrats enlisted Congressman Carter Glass to draft an alternative, supposedly progressive bill, which became known as the Glass-Owen Bill. It was publicly positioned as a populist correction to that evil Aldrich plan, with oversight supposedly coming from a government-appointed board rather than those greedy bankers. But here is the incredible secret. The final legislation contained the exact same core architecture that Paul Warburg had designed in secret on Jekyll Island. The regional banks, the elastic currency, the lender of last resort, the whole shebang was virtually intact. It was just wearing a shiny new political wrapper. And with this new progressive branding, the bill moved incredibly fast. Right before the Christmas holiday, the House passed it on December 22, 1913. The Senate followed suit the very next day, and at 6 p.m. that evening, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, famously using 4 different pens to mark the historic occasion. But we really have to stop and ask, who actually ended up owning this massive new system? Well, the regional Fed banks required their member banks to purchase stock, and the largest shareholders of the incredibly powerful New York Fed, you guessed it, National City Bank with its deep Rockefeller ties, and the National Bank of Commerce with its massive Morgan ties. The very institutions that were represented in secret at Jekyll Island were directly embedded into the ownership structure of the new institution itself. Honestly, the most remarkable part of this whole thing, this origin story was successfully suppressed for 2 full decades. It wasn't until the early 1930s that the truth finally came to light. And the only reason it did was because Senator Carter Glass published a memoir claiming he deserved sole credit for creating the Federal Reserve. This totally infuriated the original Jekyll Island participants. It prompted Paul Warburg and Frank Vanderlip to finally publish the actual truth about their clandestine meeting. They even admitted that if the public had known what they were doing at the time, it would have been instantly denounced as Wall Street chicanery. Which leaves us with one final, lingering question. Were these men patriots solving a genuine crisis that kept repeatedly devastating the country, pragmatically hiding their involvement just because they knew the general public wouldn't understand the complex economic science? Or were they oligarchs, designing a massive machine in absolute secrecy to protect and enrich their own specific financial empires? The honest truth from all the historical sources is, well, it's likely a bit of both. But it really forces us to grapple with a pretty paradoxical truth. The modern economy that shapes our lives every single day relies heavily on a system that was designed by elites operating completely in the shadows. Definitely something to think about the next time you look at a dollar bill in your wallet.